The alert came without warning. One moment I was reviewing fuel consumption logs for the third time that morning, the way I always do when a long patrol shift has nothing interesting left to offer. The next moment, every screen on the bridge of the Iroko went completely black. Not a system failure, not a power surge. Everything cut cleanly, simultaneously, as if someone had reached through deep space and pressed a single button. And then, before anyone on my crew could speak, the screens came back. But they were not showing our data anymore. What filled every monitor, every panel, every glass surface from the navigation console to the rear observation port was a seal. It was vast and circular, made of shapes that no human hand had designed. Rings of alien script rotated slowly around a central point of pure white light. Below it, in at least 40 languages, including English, the words read, "The Galactic Council, in session, binding, and final." I stood up from my chair. My crew was already frozen. Lieutenant Owen Hale had his hands above his keyboard but was not typing. Engineer Priya Sutton had turned completely away from her station. Navigator Cal Drummond had gone so still that I could count the seconds between his breaths. They were all looking at me. That is the thing nobody tells you about command. In the worst moments, nobody looks at the threat. They look at you. I kept my voice level. Record everything. The seal dissolved. In its place appeared a chamber so large that the camera rendering it could not find the walls. Thousands of alien representatives sat in curved tiers that rose into a ceiling hidden by light. Species I recognized from intelligence files. Species I had never seen. Creatures of gas, of crystal, of dense biological matter that pulsed and shifted as they breathed. At the center, elevated above all others, sat the Galactic High Speaker. The Varek called it the Eminence. We called it, in our private mission files, the Chandelier, because it hung in the air above its own platform on filaments of bioluminescent tissue that spread outward like the arms of a deep-sea creature that had never needed to be afraid of anything. When it spoke, the translation came instantly, fed through every communication system the Council had cracked in the last decade of covert preparation. People of Earth, the Galactic Council has deliberated for 32 of your years on the question of human civilization. Today, that deliberation ends. Your species has demonstrated a consistent pattern of territorial expansion, weapons development, and unilateral action in sectors designated as neutral under galactic law. You are a young species. You are a dangerous species. The Council, in its mercy, offers you one opportunity to avoid consequences that would otherwise be inevitable and complete. You will stand down all active warship operations within the next 72 hours. You will lower planetary defense grids. You will submit full military inventories for Council review. You will accept designation as a protected developing civilization, under Council supervision, for a period of no fewer than 200 years. These are not negotiable terms. These are the conditions of your continued existence. The chandelier paused. Every species in that chamber was silent. You have 72 hours. The Council awaits your formal reply. The seal reappeared for 3 seconds. Then every screen went back to its normal operational display, as if nothing had happened, as if the last 4 minutes had not just informed 8 billion human beings that an interstellar government was giving them 3 days to surrender or face destruction. For 2 seconds, nobody on my bridge moved. Then Owen said, very quietly, "Captain Osei." I was already walking toward the communications array. The all-fleet channel was still open. It stays open during any Council broadcast by standing protocol, so that every commanding officer in the United Earth Space Fleet receives the same information at the same moment. I could see the feed indicators. 41 ships were active and listening. I could see admirals on split screens, some of them already muting their feeds, already reaching for encrypted lines back to Earth, already beginning the careful process of figuring out what to say to governments that were almost certainly in full collapse. I pulled up the Council's open reply channel. It was still live. They had left it live on purpose, because they expected us to need time, to need discussions, to need committee formations and parliamentary procedures and tearful press briefings. They expected us to be slow, because every other species they had ever issued this ultimatum to had been slow. I opened the channel. "This is Captain Yara Osei, commanding officer of the Yusef battlecruiser Iroko. speaking on behalf of the active United Earth Space Fleet. The Galactic Council's offer has been received and reviewed. Our response is as follows. I paused for exactly one breath, not because I needed it, but because I wanted every translator in that chamber to catch up. We will assault first. I closed the channel. The bridge was so quiet that I could hear the ventilation system cycling through its regular rotation. Cal was staring at me with his mouth slightly open. Priya had both hands over the edge of her console like she was bracing for impact. Owen had not moved at all. He looked like a man trying to decide if he had heard the words correctly and had concluded that he had, but was not sure what that meant for the next 5 minutes of his life. From the All-Fleet channel, I heard Admiral George Patwell's voice cut through. He was a careful man. He had spent 30 years being careful. Captain Osei, stand by for direct command communication. Do not transmit further on the open channel. I turned to Owen. Log that we received the Admiral's message. Yes, Captain. And log that I am choosing not to stand by. Owen blinked, then he nodded and started typing. The Council's reply channel lit up 6 seconds later. Not from the chandelier. From one of the secondary representatives, a Varric delegate whose face filled our screen with an expression that I had learned to read in 2 years of tense border negotiations. It was the expression of a species that had never, in its recorded history, been talked back to by someone smaller. Captain Osei. The translator flattened the contempt in its voice, but not entirely. The Council asks you to clarify your statement. Surely the translation encountered an error. I sat back down in my chair. I crossed one leg over the other. I let 3 full seconds pass before I replied. There was no error. The Council issued a deadline. We are going to make it irrelevant. That is our reply. You can record it however you like. I cut the feed. Priya let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped in her chest since the chandelier started speaking. Cal put his head down on the navigation console for exactly 2 seconds, then lifted it again. Owen was still typing. That was what I liked about Owen. He kept logging. No matter what happened, he kept the record going. They will call that a declaration, Cal said. It is one, I said. We have 41 ships, he said. I know how many ships we have, Cal. They have several thousand. I know that too. He looked at me for a long moment. He was not afraid exactly. Cal Drummond had flown through a debris field at maximum speed on a dare when he was 23 years old, and had come out the other side with a smile on his face and 3 dents in his hull. Fear was not his issue. His issue was math, and the math was not comfortable. Are we actually going to do this? He asked. I pulled up the star charts. The Veil Gate floated in the display, 64 light minutes from Earth's outer marker, a superstructure the size of a moon that the Council used to control faster-than-light transit into our solar system. They had placed it there 3 years ago. They had called it a navigation aid. We had always known what it really was. Yes, I said, we are going to do this. On the All-Fleet channel, I could hear 17 different admirals talking at once. Earth's governments were already flooding the military frequencies with requests for statements, for protocols, for calm. The UN emergency session had convened in 11 minutes, which was, I noted, 9 minutes faster than their previous record. None of it mattered right now. What mattered was the 72-hour clock that had just started running in the minds of 47 alien civilizations. They were expecting us to spend those hours in panic and negotiation. They had studied humanity for 32 years, and had somehow concluded that when the moment came, we would hesitate. I had spent my entire career making sure that people who thought that were wrong. I opened a private channel to my department heads and told them to meet me in the war room in 10 minutes. Then I leaned back in my captain's chair and looked at the star chart for a long, quiet moment. The Veil Gate pulsed softly in the display, steady and certain, the way everything looks when it does not yet know it is about to be taken apart. I was going to fix that. The war room of the Iroko was not built for comfort. It was built for honesty. The table in the center was plain, the lighting was sharp, and the walls were covered with data instead of decoration. There were no windows. I had always liked that about it. Windows give you something beautiful to look at when the conversation gets difficult. A war room should not have anything beautiful in it. A war room should force you to look at the problem. I stood at the head of the table and looked at my 6 department heads. Owen on my left, Priya across from him, Cal at the far end, and beside him, Dr. Nadia Voss, our medical and biochemical intelligence officer, who knew more about alien biology than anyone in the fleet, and had opinions about everything. On my right sat Commander Ben Ashford, tactical, who had planned more combat simulations than he had slept hours in the last 18 months. And beside him, the person I had been most curious to watch during the Council broadcast, Envoy Threx. Threx was not human. He was a Sulari, one of the smaller species in the Galactic Register, bipedal, covered in fine silver-gray scales that shifted color slightly with his emotional state. He had been assigned to my ship 14 months ago as part of an exchange program that the Council had intended as a monitoring arrangement, and that I had immediately converted into something more useful. Threx was the most intelligent non-human being I had ever met, and he was also, at this moment, the most uncomfortable-looking creature in the room. His scales had shifted to a pale, almost colorless silver. In Solari physiology, that meant something close to what humans would call dread. "You replied before any Earth government had a chance to authorize a response," he said. "Yes," I said. "You are aware that what you said constitutes a formal declaration of hostile intent under galactic protocol." "I am." He folded his hands on the table. Solari hands have 7 fingers each, and he had learned, over the 14 months on this ship, to hold them still when he was in meetings, because their natural tendency to articulate individually when he was thinking gave too much away. "Captain Osei, I have been stationed on this vessel long enough to understand that you are not impulsive. You do not speak before you have thought. So I am asking you, in the spirit of the working relationship we have built, what exactly is the plan?" "The plan," I said, "starts with making sure everyone in this room understands what the Council got wrong when they decided to issue that ultimatum." I pulled up the tactical display. The holographic model of the Veil Gate rotated above the table, surrounded by the Council's fleet disposition data that our long-range sensors had been compiling for the last 8 weeks. 46 warships holding position at various distances from the gate. Another estimated 200 in rapid response range within 12 light hours. Against the Iroko and our 41 active fleet vessels, the math looked the way it always did when you put human numbers next to Council numbers. Impossible. Right up until it was not. "The Council," I said, "has been studying humanity for 32 years. They have files on every conflict we have ever fought. They have psychological profiles on our military leadership. They have atmospheric and geological data on Earth going back further than our own records. They have built a model of what humanity is, and they believe that model is accurate. And the model says," I looked at Ben Ashford, "What does their model say, Commander?" Ben had been through the intelligence files 3 times in the last month. He had practically memorized the sections on Council threat assessment methodology. "Their model says that when faced with an overwhelming force differential, human military command will default to protective posture. They expect us to move assets into defensive orbital positions. They expect leadership to seek negotiation from a position of demonstrated restraint. They believe our decision-making is driven primarily by fear of losing, which they calculate will override any instinct toward confrontation when the odds are sufficiently unfavorable." "And where did they get that model?" I asked. "From watching us fight each other," Owen said. "Exactly." I moved to the second display. It showed Earth's history as a timeline. Not political history, not cultural history, but specifically the history of human conflict and its outcomes. Every war we have ever fought among ourselves ended. That is the data point the Council latched onto. Every conflict has a resolution. Every resolution involved negotiation of some kind. They concluded from this that humanity, when faced with a strong enough opponent, will always find a way to stop. "That is a reasonable conclusion from the available data," Threx said carefully. "It is the wrong conclusion," I said, "because they missed something fundamental about why those wars ended." I looked around the table. Our wars ended because both sides were human. Because the people across the line were people we could talk to. People who ate and slept and bled the same way we did. People who wanted to stop hurting eventually because the things they were hurting were not so different from themselves. We stopped fighting each other because we recognized each other. I paused. The Council is not going to get that recognition from us. We do not see them the way we see ourselves, and that changes everything about how we will respond. Dr. Voss leaned forward. You are saying the deterrent that worked in every human conflict fails here, because the psychological mechanism behind it is absent. I am saying the Council prepared for a human response by studying the wrong kind of human experience, I said. They prepared for us to act the way we act when we are talking to ourselves. We are not going to do that. Ben pulled up the weapons systems overview. The Oroko's armament was not the largest in the fleet, but it was the most precisely calibrated. I had spent 2 years making sure of it. Our rail cannons could fire at angles that required real-time gravitational compensation, which meant we could hit targets while maneuvering at speeds most Council ships did not consider survivable. Our shield harmonics were layered in a rotating frequency pattern that Priya had developed 18 months ago, and that no Council sensor array had ever successfully mapped. We were not the biggest. We were not the most numerous. What we were was specifically, deliberately built to do things that the Council's threat models had not accounted for. Threx was watching me. His scales had shifted from colorless silver to something slightly warmer. Still apprehensive, but with something else in it. Curiosity, maybe. Or the beginning of understanding. There is something you should know about us, I said, and I was not talking only to my crew. I was thinking about the open channel I had left running on a narrowband relay, the one that was still transmitting to the Council's listening posts. I had opened it quietly, before the meeting, because the meeting itself was part of the plan. The thing the Council missed is not tactical, it is not technological, it is something much simpler. I pulled up the last display. It was not a weapons diagram, it was a photograph. It had been taken 600 years ago, in the early days of human space exploration, when a small probe had reached the edge of our solar system and turned its camera back toward the tiny distant dot that was Earth. A pale blue point of light suspended in empty space, surrounded by nothing, protected by nothing, completely alone. We sent that probe out into the dark, I said, before we had any idea what was out there. We did not know if anything was listening. We did not know if anything would find it. We did not know if we would survive long enough to matter. We sent it because we wanted to know. Not because it was safe. Not because it was strategic. Because we wanted to know. The room was very quiet. The Council modeled us as a threat because we build weapons. They are right that we build weapons. What they do not understand is why. We build them for the same reason we built that probe. Because the universe is vast, and strange, and full of things that can end us, and we refuse to die before we have seen all of it. I looked at Threx. We are not fighting because we think we can win by their math. We are fighting because we do not accept that their math is the only math that matters. Threx was quiet for a long time. His scales had gone to a warm, pale gold, a color I had never seen on him before. I did not know exactly what it meant in Solari physiology, but he did not look afraid anymore. The Veil Gate, Ben said, studying the tactical display. You want to go for it directly. Within the first 30 hours, I said, before they expect us to move at all. Owen looked up from his notes. 41 ships against their gate garrison. 41 ships moving in a pattern no Council commander has ever modeled in a simulation, I said. Because no Council commander has ever believed a species in our position would actually do it. Cal was already smiling at the end of the table. That was the thing about Cal. The math never bothered him once the decision was made. What's our jump window? We calculated in the next 6 hours, I said. We move in the next 24. Priya was running numbers at her portable console, her fingers moving fast and quiet. She did not look up when she said, I can have the shield rotation updated before we jump. Good, I said. I looked around the table one more time. These were the people I had chosen. The people who had chosen this ship, this mission, this particular way of spending their lives. They were not reckless. They were not careless. They were people who had looked at the size of the universe and decided that the right response to it was to go forward. The Council had 32 years of data on humanity. They had somehow missed the most important thing. We do not calculate whether we can make it, we calculate how. The jump to the Veil Gate took 11 seconds of transit time and several thousand hours of preparation, compressed into 23 hours of furious work. I was on the bridge when the countdown reached 0. The star field on the main display collapsed into the white tunnel of faster-than-light transit, and for 11 seconds the Iroko moved faster than anything the Council's threat models had projected for a vessel of our class. That was the first mistake they had built into their calculations. They had used our official performance specifications, which were the specifications we had filed in the Neutral Space Registry 2 years ago. They were not our actual specifications. Priya had seen to that. We came out of transit 63,000 kilometers from the Veil Gate. It was enormous, in a way that numbers do not prepare you for. At that range, it filled 40% of our forward display. It was made of the same dark composite material the Council used for all of its major structures, a substance that absorbed most scan frequencies and reflected almost nothing, which made it look like a wound in space rather than a construction. At its center, the transit aperture glowed with a steady blue-white light, large enough to pass a small moon through without touching the sides. Around the main structure, arranged in defensive formation, were 16 Council warships. They were not in combat alert. They were in standard patrol formation, engines at low power, weapons unpowered. They had not believed we would come. All fleet confirmed transit, Owen said. Behind us, in the space we had just arrived from, the other 40 ships of our formation were dropping out of transit in precise sequence, each one taking its assigned position in a deployment pattern that Ben Ashford had spent 19 hours designing, and that bore no resemblance to any human tactical formation the Council had ever recorded, because it had been built specifically for this approach and had never existed before this moment. Fleet confirms, Owen said. All 41 ships present and holding position. Weapons status, I said. Rail cannons charged, Ben said from his tactical station. Targeting solutions locked on primary and secondary gate emitters. All ships confirm ready. On the communications panel, the Council frequencies were lighting up. The gate garrison commander was broadcasting on the standard challenge frequency, demanding identification and authorization codes. The broadcast was calm. They were still operating on the assumption that what they were seeing was an anomaly, perhaps a navigational error, perhaps a small patrol group that had somehow miscalculated their transit coordinates. Open the fleet channel, I said. Owen opened it. All ships, this is Captain Osei. Attack pattern Delta 7. We go in 30 seconds. Hold your vectors and do not deviate for anything. They are going to be surprised, and a surprised enemy is a disorganized enemy, and a disorganized enemy can be moved through. 30 seconds. Mark. I watched the clock. The Council's challenge broadcasts were getting sharper now, the calm replaced by something more urgent. On the tactical display, I could see 2 of the gate garrison ships beginning to raise their energy signatures, powering weapons, finally understanding that this was not a navigational error. They were 30 seconds too late. Execute, I said. The Iroko moved. I have been in combat before. I know what it sounds like from inside the hull of a ship that is fully committed to an engagement. The deep resonance of the rail cannons, the shift in the deck as the thrusters push the ship through maneuvers that the artificial gravity system scrambles to compensate for. The particular sharp sound of an incoming round striking the outer shielding and being deflected. I know all of it, but there is nothing quite like the first 30 seconds of an attack that the enemy did not expect. We hit the 2 closest garrison ships before they finished powering their weapons, not with enough force to destroy them. I had given specific orders on that point, and every gunner in the fleet understood why. Disabled, not gone. The Council was going to be negotiating with us in the next 48 hours, and I did not want to negotiate over a field of wreckage. The garrison formation broke the way formations break when the center is hit before the edges have information. The outer ships moved to cover, but they moved toward where the threat model told them we would be, not where we actually were. Ben's attack pattern had accounted for this. Our ships were already somewhere else. We took a hit to the aft port section in the first 4 minutes. I felt it through the deck, a long, rolling vibration that Priya's voice immediately translated into data over the intercom. Outer hull breach in Section 14. No atmosphere loss. Damage control responding. Keep us moving, I said to Cal. Keeping us moving, he said, and the Iroko banked hard to starboard, at a rate that pressed us all sideways for 3 full seconds, which was 3 seconds longer than the artificial gravity could compensate for at that angle, which was exactly why Cal had chosen that angle. A ship that puts its crew through physical discomfort to complete a maneuver is a ship that is willing to push past what is comfortable. The Council's pilots, trained in a military culture that prioritized crew welfare during all maneuvers, did not have a response pattern for it. We were through the outer defensive ring in 11 minutes. The gate itself had its own defense systems, automated, fast, capable of targeting and firing in the time it took a human reflex to register a signal. I had read every piece of intelligence we had on those systems. I had read it until I could reconstruct the firing pattern from memory. The automated defenses had two known limitations. They were calibrated to target ships moving at or below a certain threshold speed, because the engineers who built them had assumed no attacker would attempt to approach a structure the size of the Veil Gate at speeds that made precision docking impossible. And they had a rotation cycle, a 3-second window every 47 seconds where the targeting array was resetting. "Priya," I said. "Counting," she said. She had been counting the rotation cycle since our sensors first picked up the gate's emissions. 3, 2, 1. Cal, now. The Oroco went to full thrust for exactly 4 seconds, covering the distance to the gate's command core access point at a speed that the automated defense system's targeting algorithm could not follow. 3 of the gate's defensive emitters fired. All 3 shots went wide. Then the rotation cycle reset, and before it came back online, we were too close to the structure for it to target without risk of damaging its own hull. We had 5 minutes before the cycle gave it a clean angle on us again. "Boarding team," I said. Ben was already standing. He had 12 people ready in the secondary airlock, not soldiers in the traditional sense, not any more than any of us were. They were crew members who had trained for close-range boarding operations because I had required it of everyone on this ship when I took command, on the reasoning that a crew that only knows how to fight from inside a vessel is a crew with one option removed. I went with them. I want to be clear about why I went personally, because it was not theatrical, and it was not reckless. The command core of the Veil Gate had to be secured by someone who had the authorization codes for the Council's diplomatic frequency, because the next step after securing it was going to involve a broadcast, and that broadcast needed to come from me specifically, not from a team member relaying my words, from me. The Council needed to hear my voice in that room. We breached the access point and moved through the gate's interior corridors. The interior was vast and cold and designed for species larger than humans on average, which meant the ceiling was high, and the spaces were open, and there was very little cover for the gate's internal security teams to use against us, because they had never anticipated a boarding scenario where a smaller species would find the open spaces advantageous. We moved faster than the security teams expected. We communicated with shorter signals. We fit through access passages they could not follow us through. The command core was at the geometric center of the structure. When I came through the door, the Varric Fleet Admiral, who had been coordinating the gate garrison's response from that room, looked at me with an expression that I recognized across every species barrier I had ever encountered. It was the expression of someone who had run every reasonable scenario in their mind and had arrived at a conclusion they did not want to accept. I was standing in the center of the Veil Gate's command core, and I was not supposed to be here, and there was nothing in any of his tactical models that covered this moment. I held up one hand, not a threatening gesture, an arresting one. "I am going to use your broadcasting system," I said. "You are going to let me, because the alternative is that my engineer disables this gate's transit function entirely, and neither of us wants that." I looked directly at him for a long moment. "Step away from the console." He stepped away from the console. I opened the council-wide broadcast frequency from the command core of their own installation. Every species in range, every monitoring station, every listening post between here and the council's home sectors. "This is Captain Yara Osei. I am transmitting from the command core of the Veil Gate, which is now under the control of the United Earth Space Fleet. The gate garrison has been engaged and disabled. No lives have been lost. The installation is intact." I paused. The 72-hour clock has stopped. "The Galactic Council will meet with Earth's representatives within the next 24 hours, in a neutral forum, with no preconditions, and no surrender terms on the table. If this does not happen, the next transmission from this location will announce that this gate is closed to all traffic indefinitely." I looked at the Varric Admiral. He had not moved. His species did not show emotion the way humans did. The chrome-plated exterior of Varric physiognomy was not capable of the small movements that human faces use to express what is happening inside. But there is something that happens in the posture of any living thing when it encounters a situation its entire training has failed to prepare it for. A kind of stillness that is different from the stillness of confidence. I had seen it before, in meeting rooms and negotiating chambers and across the table from people who had expected this conversation to go another way. It looked the same in every species. "The Council awaits your reply," I said, the way the chandelier had said it to us, in the same tone, at the same measured pace. I was not mocking it. I was reminding every listener that the words meant something different when the person saying them was standing in a room they were not supposed to be able to reach. I closed the broadcast. Ben Ashford appeared at my shoulder. "Fleet is holding position. We have control of all gate approach vectors. Garrison ships have powered down." "Good," I said. "The Admiral on the Patwell line wants to speak with you." "He can wait 20 minutes, I said. "I want the damage assessment on Section 14 first." Ben almost smiled. "Yes, Captain." I looked around the command corps. The Varric Admiral was still standing where he had stepped, immobile and unreadable, his eyes tracking me with the particular attention of someone who is filing everything away for later analysis. I understood that. I did the same thing. "I am going to need your name," I told him, "for the negotiation records." He looked at me for a long moment. Then, in a voice that the translator rendered as flat and precise, he said, "High Commander Varath, of the 7th Council Enforcement Division." "Thank you, High Commander Varath," I said. I meant it genuinely. In my experience, the moment someone on the other side of a conflict tells you their name is the moment the conflict has moved from the stage of fighting to the stage of something that might eventually be resolved. I turned back to the broadcast console and started reviewing the frequency logs to see which council sectors had confirmed receipt of my transmission. All of them had. Behind me, I heard something I had not expected. It was a very quiet sound, almost at the edge of hearing. The sound of High Commander Varath settling his weight back into a different posture. Not relaxing exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something like the beginning of adjustment. They sent a transport for me. That was the first surprise. Not a military escort with weapons visible and intent clear. An actual diplomatic transport. Sleek, quiet, the Galactic Council's seal on its hull, in the specific color arrangement that their protocol division reserved for formal summoning of heads of state. They sent it to the Veil Gate, where I was sitting in the command corps reviewing repair logs from the Iroko's Section 14 damage, and a council protocol officer came through the door, a small species, round-bodied, with 4 arms and an expression of practiced professional neutrality, and informed me that the Galactic Council had convened an emergency plenary session and that my presence was formally requested. "Requested," I said. "Requested," the protocol officer confirmed, in a tone that made it clear the distinction from required was meaningful. Threx was at my shoulder. His scales had gone to a color I had started to think of as his thinking and concerned shade, a blue-gray that reminded me of early morning sky over water. "You should go," he said quietly. "I know," I said. "I mean, you should go now, before they reconsider the phrasing." I went. I did not change my flight suit. Threx walked beside me to the transport. At the boarding hatch, he stopped. "I cannot enter the chamber," he said. "Sulari envoys are non-voting observers. My presence would not be formally recognized." "I know," I said. He was quiet for a moment. His scales shifted, just slightly, to a warmer color. "You will not have anyone in that room who is on your side." "I will have me," I said. He looked at me with the particular expression he had developed over 14 months of watching humans do things that his cultural framework did not have a category for. "That is what I mean," he said. "Do not forget that it is enough." I stepped onto the transport. The journey to the Grand Council chamber was 4 hours of faster-than-light transit, during which I sat alone in the passenger section of the diplomatic vessel, and did not sleep, and did not read, and did not review any files. I sat with my hands in my lap and I thought about my mother, who had been a secondary school teacher in Accra, and who had told me once, when I was 9 years old and afraid of something I could no longer remember, that the most powerful thing a person can do in a room where everyone is against them is to already know what they believe before they walk in. "You cannot figure out what you think while the argument is happening around you," she had said. You have to know it beforehand. I knew what I thought. I had known it my whole life. I had just never had to say it to 47 civilizations at once. The Grand Council chamber was larger in person than any rendering had prepared me for. I stepped through the entrance and for one moment, just one, I let myself feel the full weight of the space. The tiers rose farther than I could clearly see. The representatives of 47 species were arranged in curved rows that formed a complete circle around the central floor where I now stood. There were no guards around me. There was no cage, no dock, no formal restraint of any kind. I was simply standing in the middle of the most powerful deliberative body in the known galaxy, in a scorched flight suit, alone. I stood straight. The Galactic High Speaker descended from its elevated platform on its filaments of bioluminescent tissue, stopping at a height that put its central sensory organs level with my face. Up close, it was even stranger than it had appeared on the broadcast. The filaments were constantly in motion, making small adjustments the way a person's hands move when they are paying close attention. Captain Yara Ose, it said. The translator was perfectly calibrated for the chamber's acoustics. Every representative heard it simultaneously in their own language. The Council acknowledges your presence. I acknowledge the Council's, I said. A murmur moved through the tiers. I was not sure whether it was surprise at the response, or the simple noise of 47 species, all having a small reaction at the same time. The chandelier's filaments moved in a way that I could not read. You stand here as a result of an unauthorized act of military aggression against a Council installation, it said. I stand here as a result of an act of military necessity, in response to an ultimatum that gave Earth 3 days to surrender its sovereignty, I said. The Council will forgive me if I do not accept the first framing. The murmur again, louder this time. The Council has considered your transmission from the Veil Gate, the chandelier said. A formal session was difficult to avoid, given the circumstances. However, the Council's position has not changed. Humanity represents an unacceptable level of destabilizing risk within the galactic community. Then let me address that position, I said. The chandelier's filaments extended slightly. You have the floor. I did not look at notes. I had none. The Council spent 32 years studying human civilization before issuing its ultimatum. I want to acknowledge that this is a significant investment of time and attention, and I want to acknowledge that much of what was observed during those 32 years was genuinely alarming by almost any standard. We fight. We have always fought. Our history is dense with conflict, and anyone reviewing it without context would be right to be concerned. I paused, letting the translators complete the sentence in every language before I continued. But I want to ask the Council to consider what it did not study. Because in 32 years of watching us fight, I believe certain things were not placed on the record. I turned slowly, not dramatically, just to address different sections of the chamber as I spoke. We are the only known species that evolved on a planet that actively and continuously tried to kill us. Our planet is beautiful, and it has always been trying to end us. Pathogens evolved alongside us with the specific purpose of defeating our immune systems. Natural events on scales that would sterilize most inhabited worlds have struck Earth multiple times. We have no natural armor. We are not the largest animals we share the planet with. We are not the fastest. We are, in purely biological terms, one of the more fragile, complex organisms on our world. And yet we are here. We are not here because the universe was gentle with us. We are here because we are constitutionally, biologically, culturally, incapable of accepting that something ends us, and simply letting it. I stopped in the center of the floor. The Council's threat assessment identified this as instability, and I understand why. A species that will not stop, that will not accept an unfavorable calculation and adjust its behavior accordingly, is a species that is difficult to predict and difficult to contain. I am not here to argue that this assessment is wrong. I am here to ask whether it is complete. A representative from the upper tiers, a species I recognized as the Orath, insectoid, deeply ancient, one of the founding civilizations of the current Council, spoke in a clicking tone that the translator rendered as sharp and formal. What does the captain believe the Council has omitted from its assessment? What we built, I said. I pulled up a small display from the device in my flight suit pocket, a simple projector, nothing impressive by Council standards, but projecting clearly enough to fill the central floor with images. Our art, our music, represented as visual data, the waveforms of 10,000 years of human sound, our architecture, our science, the images of Earth from space, from orbit, from the surface of other worlds we had reached before we had faster-than-light travel, just because we wanted to see them. We sent a probe to the edge of our solar system before we knew anything was out there, I said, carrying sounds and pictures and a map to our location, addressed to whoever might find it. We did not know who would find it. We did not know if it was safe. We did not know if the galaxy was full of beings who would come to destroy us the moment they knew where we were. We sent it because we wanted to reach out, because we are a species that, at its core, wants to be known and wants to know. I let the display run. We fought each other for 10,000 years, and also, during those 10,000 years, we wrote every piece of music in this display. We painted everything in this catalog. We built hospitals on the land where we had just fought battles. We wrote laws to protect people who had no power, and we failed those laws constantly, and we kept rewriting them, and we kept arguing about them, and we kept trying. My voice stayed even. I had practiced this, not the words but the steadiness. The council is correct that we are dangerous, but we are dangerous in the same direction as everything else we are. We pursue things with a completeness that does not recognize the option of stopping. We pursue our own worst impulses that way. We also pursue love, and science, and exploration, and justice, exactly the same way. The chamber was very quiet. You offered us protected status, I said. 200 years of supervised development. I want you to understand what that would actually mean, not politically, not militarily, but in terms of what it would do to us. You would be asking us to stop. You would be asking the species that sent a probe into the dark on the chance that someone was listening to accept that someone had finally heard us, and the answer was, stay where you are and stop reaching. I looked directly at the chandelier. We cannot do that. Not because we are arrogant, not because we are hostile, because stopping is not something we know how to do. And the council, with 32 years of data, should have seen that. The chamber erupted. Not in anger, in the particular kind of noise that happens when many different species, with many different responses to significant information, all react at the same time. I stood in the middle of it and did not move. It was several minutes before the chandelier restored order. And then, from the upper tiers, in a tone that the translator rendered with careful precision, the ancient Orath representative spoke again. The captain speaks of human intention, but intention is not the same as outcome. The council must concern itself with outcomes. Then I would invite the council, I said, to consider the outcome if you continue on the current path. You will attempt to enforce compliance on a species that cannot comply. You will be in a permanent state of conflict with the one civilization in this galaxy that has proven, across its entire history, that it does not run out of will. I am not threatening you. I am telling you that this is the mathematical reality, and I believe the council is good at math. Another long silence. And then, from the side of the chamber, a soft sound began. It was coming from the Sulari section of the tiered seating, an area I had not looked at directly, because Threx had told me he could not be in the chamber. But someone was in the Sulari section. Someone was making the low harmonic sound that was, in Sulari culture, the equivalent of a formal declaration of witness, a statement that what one had seen was true and should be placed on record. I turned. Threx was standing in the Sulari Observer's enclosure, a section I had not known existed, because it was not in any floor plan I had reviewed. He was standing fully upright, his scales the warm gold I had seen once before, in the war room when I had spoken about the probe. He was performing the witness declaration in the middle of the Grand Council chamber. In the formal record of the session, what he said translated as follows: I have lived among this species for over a year. I have observed them in conditions of extreme stress, in conflict, and in quiet. I offer this testimony freely and without prompting. Humans help each other when there is nothing to gain from it. I have seen this repeatedly and without exception. In every crisis, including the one we are currently experiencing, the first instinct of every human being I have observed has not been self-preservation. It has been to look around and see who else needed help. He paused. I do not know if the Council considers this relevant to its threat assessment. I believe it is the most relevant data point available." He sat back down. The chamber was the quietest I had heard it. I was standing in the center of the floor, and for the first time since the council broadcast had appeared on the Iroko's screens, I felt something shift inside me. Not relief, not yet. Something more fundamental. The particular sensation of a weight you have been carrying for so long that you stopped noticing it, making itself felt at the moment when it is about to be set down. My hands were shaking. I looked down at them with something close to surprise. They had not shaken in years. Not since Lagos 3. Not since the debrief that followed it. Not through any of the 23 months of preparation and tension that had led to this moment. I had been steady through all of it. Standing alone in the middle of 47 civilizations, I had been steady. And now, with Threx's voice still completing its echo through the chamber's acoustics, my hands were shaking. Not from fear. I had been right about that at least. From the weight of 8 billion people who had no idea I was here, who were watching news feeds and government statements, and trying to understand what was happening, who had built every beautiful thing in that display, and also every ugly thing, who had written laws and broken them and rewritten them, who had sent probes into the dark because they needed to know. I had spoken for all of them, and somewhere in the last 6 minutes, I had started to believe it might have been enough. The chandelier called for a formal recess. I sat down on the floor of the Grand Council chamber, not for drama, just because there was nowhere else to sit, and I put my hands flat against the surface and waited for them to stop shaking. The vote took 9 hours. I waited in an antechamber of the Grand Council building, a room that was clearly designed for beings considerably larger than me, sitting in a chair that was proportioned for a Varric, and therefore gave me the experience of sitting in a piece of furniture that had never considered human dimensions relevant. The protocol officer brought me something to drink, a neutral compound that the council medical systems had determined was safe for human biochemistry, tasting faintly of something I decided to think of as tea. I did not sleep. I had stopped expecting to sleep during high-stakes situations years ago. Sleep was for the aftermath. Threx found me in the antechamber 4 hours in. He had been escorted out of the observer enclosure after his testimony, not removed. Escorted, which was a meaningful distinction in council protocol. He sat across from me in a chair that fit him no better than mine fit me, and for a while neither of us said anything. "You were not supposed to be in that room," I said eventually. "Solari observers are permitted in the formal witness enclosure," he said. "It is a rarely used provision. Most Solari envoys do not have anything to witness that the council has not already documented." "How long had you been planning to do that?" He was quiet for a moment. "Since the war room," he said. "When you showed the photograph of Earth from the probe. I decided then that if there was an opportunity to place formal testimony on the record, I would take it." I looked at him. "You took a significant personal risk." "I know." He held my gaze. "I have been watching your species for over a year, Captain Osei. I have filed reports. I have submitted analyses. I have used every professional tool available to me to communicate what I was observing, and every report was received and filed and changed nothing about the council's projections." He paused. "Sometimes the professional tool is not the right one." I thought about that for a while. The protocol officer appeared at the door after the 9th hour and told us the chamber was reconvening. I walked back in. I stood in the center of the floor. My hands were steady again. The chandelier descended. "The Galactic Council has completed its deliberation," it said. The vote was not unanimous. A significant minority of represented species maintained the position that humanity's designation should remain under review for a period of no fewer than 100 years, with restrictions on military development. That position has been heard and recorded. Fortune. It paused. The majority position, which carries by a margin sufficient to constitute a binding resolution, is as follows. The Galactic Council acknowledges that its original ultimatum to humanity was issued on the basis of an incomplete assessment. The Council further acknowledges that the testimony of Envoy Threx of the Solari, admitted into the formal record, presents data that was not adequately weighted in the Council's original analysis. Accordingly, the Council hereby rescinds the ultimatum issued on the date of this session. The designation of humanity as a protected developing civilization is withdrawn. Earth and its representative fleet are to be recognized, effective immediately, as a sovereign galactic member, Tier 1, with full rights of passage, representation, and self-governance under galactic law. I breathed in. I breathed out. The Council does note, the chandelier continued, and there was something in its tone that I recognized as the particular quality of an organization being honest about its own difficulty in arriving at a conclusion, that this recognition was arrived at in part because of actions taken by Captain Yara Osei that fall significantly outside the boundaries of standard diplomatic practice. I understand, I said. The Council asks only that future disputes be brought through formal channels. I will do my best, I said, which was the most honest answer I could give. The session was closed. The chandelier rose back to its platform. The representatives of 47 civilizations began the long process of filing out of the chamber in their respective delegations. The sound of it was extraordinary. Dozens of languages, dozens of modes of movement, a tide of life that I stood in the middle of for several minutes, not leaving, just existing in it. When the chamber was almost empty, I felt a presence stop beside me. High Commander Verath. He was in a different uniform now. His fleet insignia had been removed. I had learned enough about Varric military culture in the last 2 days to know what that meant. He had been relieved of his command. Not punished in the harsher sense, relieved, which was the Varric distinction for a commander who had been defeated honorably in circumstances outside their control. He stood beside me and looked at the empty chamber for a moment. Then he turned and looked at me. In the 14 months I had spent working adjacent to the Council's various delegations, I had never seen a Varric perform what he performed then. A small, precise inclination of the head, forward and down and back, held for exactly 2 seconds. It was the Varric gesture of recognition between equals. I returned it. He walked out of the chamber without another word. The transport back to the Iroko felt different from the transport to the chamber. On the way in, I had been alone with what I needed to say. On the way back, I was alone with what had actually happened. Those are different kinds of alone. The second one is heavier, because it is real. When I came back aboard the Iroko, my crew was on the bridge, all of them, including people who were not on shift, including Priya, who had worked 31 straight hours on the shield rotation, and should by any reasonable measure have been asleep. They were all there, in the way that a crew is there when something has concluded and they need to be in the same room together. Nobody spoke when I walked in. I sat down in my captain's chair. I looked at the star chart on the display. The Veil Gate was back under Council operation. We had transferred control as part of the ceasefire arrangement, formally and completely, which was important because it established that we had not wanted the gate, we had only wanted the conversation. Cal was at the navigation console. He turned and looked at me, with his particular expression of someone who has already processed the emotional content of a situation and arrived at the place where it is safe to make a quiet remark. So, he said. So, I said. How do we celebrate something like this? I thought about it for a moment. We go back to work, I said. There is still the Section 14 damage to complete, and Admiral Patwell has been waiting 20 hours for a conversation. Owen made a small sound that might have been a laugh suppressed at the last moment. Priya went back to her console. Cal turned back to the navigation display. That evening, I sat in my quarters and opened my captain's log. I had been keeping it since I took command of the Iroko 3 years ago, and it was not a formal document. It was the place where I said things that the official record did not have space for. I wrote for a long time. The galaxy had feared us because we would not stop when the calculations said we should stop. They had looked at our history and seen the stopping points, the peace treaties, the ceasefires, the negotiations, and concluded that we were a species that eventually accepted limits. They had not seen what I had always known, what every human being carries without being taught it, the thing that kept us on a planet that was trying to end us, the thing that sent a probe into the unknown and waited, the thing that built hospitals on battlefields and wrote laws that we kept failing and kept returning to. We do not stop because somewhere on the other side of everything we are afraid of, something matters to us. Someone we love is on the other side of this wall, this illness, this failure, this impossible distance, and we are going to get there, or we are going to be found moving toward it. The Council had 47 civilizations and several thousand warships, and 32 years of data on humanity. They did not have that. I finished the log. I looked out the viewport beside my bunk. Not the main observation window, just the small one. The one that shows you a single quadrant of space without any framing. Just stars going on in every direction until they go past seeing. I thought about my mother, and her classroom in Accra, and the way she had told me to know what I believed before I walked into the room. I had known. I had always known. I closed the log. Outside the viewport, the stars looked exactly the same as they always had. We just had the right to go to all of them now.